Okay, so since we brought up the concept of deviations, what do we mean by deviation? How do we manage these deviations? Now, the MISRA guidelines actually provide an example deviation report in one of their appendices. And it's actually quite good, and they tell you what do you really need to include in your deviation report. You have to know which guideline am I deviating from. You have to know the scope. Is this a system-wide project deviation, or is this a specific deviation, right? Justification. Well, you better know why you're deviating. If you're just randomly doing it, I've actually seen this in practice. I've gone to customer sites where the developer no longer works there because he was basically deviating all over the place because he didn't understand the guideline. Yeah, he's gone. But you need to give a justification for why this is okay in this circumstance. You need to provide safety assurance, right? Because remember, these guidelines are about safety. They're about preventing bugs from causing human fatality or human casualty or harm in some way. So you have to verify in your deviation that you've considered this. You've looked at the safety aspects and you've considered them from all angles. And in particular, consequences and mitigations, what have you done based on that safety assurance to make sure that it won't happen, the bad things won't happen. Now again, how do we manage this in practice? Well, let's reverse engineer it. I need something for a specific deviation that tells me exactly which line of code I'm deviating, exactly which guideline I'm deviating from, and allows me to provide a justification and a link to some external system. I need this thing to be with the code. I mean, if it's that specific, it has to point to that line of code. I can't really manage this externally in some document because the code's always changing. It's always moving all over the place. Your one line is not going to stay that line of code forever. I might branch, I might copy paste. How do I keep my deviation in sync with my code? Well, I should probably include it as a code comment. That'd be easiest. That way it branches with it, it copy pastes with it, and I can point to some other document that gives me the more detail I need. That's exactly what we do. There's your guideline right there. It's telling you you're suppressing. You know exactly which line you're suppressing on. You're able to provide your justification. And if you have any additional information to provide that doesn't feel right putting it in a code comment, you can say, hey, take a look at requirement 1, 2, 3, provide a link, whatever else, whatever other system you use for requirements or document tracking, get that done. And again, a mature development testing platform that takes you beyond just static analysis is going to be able to tie all of this together for you. Okay, so last but not least, what is the cost of adoption here? Now, this is not as much a consideration for the automotive industry where it's already been decided you're doing this. It's more for the medical industry, for aerospace. If you're someone who's not currently convinced you should be using MISRA, how do you decide that this is the right way to go? Well, cost of adoption itself is pretty easy to calculate. You can guess at how many violations you might have in your code, or even better, you can bring in some vendors and have them do a quick analysis and give you that number. You can figure out how long it takes you to fix each of these violations. Now, these are going to vary, of course, but you can get a pretty good average, pretty good sense of it over time, and base that on how much you're paying your developers and how many people need to be involved. Then you're going to add the cost of the tools and the training themselves. Now, I've actually seen this happen where people go, oh, I've got smart people, I don't need training. Well, you think you're cutting out the training cost, you're actually not. What you're doing is forcing your developers to train themselves. And you have no control over the outcome of that. You have no control over what they're going to teach themselves, and you have very little way of tracking what they've learned. So I would venture to say even that if you decide not to train, then you're incurring a lot more costs and a lot more risk than if you just go ahead and buy a training package from your vendor of choice. Okay, now more interestingly, what is the cost of non-adoption? If I don't have any standard at all that I'm following, if I'm not paying attention to the safety critical nature of my code, what could go wrong? How could that cost me as a business? There are already people who do this sort of calculation for insurance companies. But figure out what's your current number of field bugs. Most people we catch, they're in the middle of a release, right? Or they've had several releases already. So you have a good sense at this point of what is your number of field bugs. Now, you have to add a new factor, cost to find it. Because someone just triggered a symptom out in the field. Now you have to figure out what was the root cause of that thing, how do I fix this thing? That whole debugging time adds to the cost to actually fix it. That's another aspect that people forget to consider. Okay, then you've got probability of human harm. Again, this is going to vary by organization, by industry, by a lot of factors. I'm not going to supply you with a number here, but generally speaking, there's somebody in your organization who's going to know this. Find them out, figure out what that is, and then figure out what are the legal damages, actual and punitive, that you can expect based on this human harm. Okay? By the way, we're not just talking about death here. Death sometimes is less expensive than losing a limb or causing some permanent injury. All right, what about other major defects? So you could find a defect in the field. That means I cannot fix this in the field. I have to recall all of my products, or I have to replace any product that has this defect. And with software, it's usually an all or nothing thing. So you know what your unit cost to recall or replace your product is. Lastly, number of units you have out in the field or expect to have out in the field when one of these errors occur, right? These next two, not as easy to figure out, but if you want to factor them in, you can. Some people just set those to 0 and they're good with everything to this point, but if you want to do that next level of analysis, you can say, well, I do care about how much revenue do I expect to lose from this based on media coverage and so forth, and I can also figure out a rough cost of my scheduled delay. Now that I'm fixing these things, now that I'm spending all this time remediating these things that I didn't catch during development, what is my missing cycle? What features am I delaying? What new revenue am I pushing off from that perspective? And yes, they kind of bleed together a little bit. That brings us to the end of the presentation. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them and respond to them.